All right, hello once again. Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development, or AWD 1111, database-driven web development class, I'm doing a series of video presentations. I've already created about 30 presentations based off some of the handbooks or PDF files from Mr. Flavio Copes at his thevalleyofcode.com website. Those were all based on client-side development. So there were HTML, CSS, and JavaScript lectures. Now I'm moving over to a PDF book that was created by Mr. Brad Traversy, a self-taught developer. And this is his web dev guide. I am in the middle of I think it's unit 3. It's either 3 or 4. So I'm about 127, make that 128 pages in to a 306-page document. All right. So let's go in and talk about web APIs. It says there are a bunch of HTML and JavaScript APIs that are available in the browser environment. I think at this point you should at least know some of these, as they can be very useful in building applications. We will discuss some of these, but you can see a full list here. So let's look. All right. So you can see there's a lot of them. This is by no means an all-extensive or all-inclusive list either. All right. The Geolocation API provides a way for users of your applications to provide their location. Maybe you have seen this before. As an example, if I want restaurants, and if I'm on my phone and I put in restaurants, typically they'll ask you a question like, is it okay basically to use your current location? Why? Because they want to be able to look for restaurants that are near you. All right. And they use things like current position and watch position. As it says, this is extremely useful for any application that needs a user's location. Audio and video APIs. We talked about audio and video tags earlier. When you select a video or audio element in the JavaScript, there's different ways. So you've got control, how you play them, how you move from track to track, etc. All right. Drag and drop API. As it says here, it uses the document object model's event model and drag events to be able to move around. Okay. The Canvas API for drawing items using JavaScript. The Web Speech API, as it says, it's great for speech recognition as well as generating voices and text to speak. WebRTC, as they say, that's the RTC is real-time communication. You can do things like build the equivalent of your own chat app. Some of the chat apps that I see that are built in this, all right, they're, for lack of better words, we'll say a little cheesy. They almost look like in the olden days when we used walkie-talkies. And we could, my brother and I each had a walkie-talkie, and as long as we were within a few hundred feet of one another, we could talk back and forth. Well, that's kind of what is happening here, but you don't have to be a few hundred feet away. But it's just a very simple little way to be able to capture speech, capture words, and go back and forth. The WebSockets API, as it says, allows you to create a two-way session, so it allows you to communicate with a server. And you can use that, as it says, again with chats or anything using CRUD. Create, read, update, and delete. All right, let's jump in then and talk about Axios. And as mentioned here, it says we talked about the native fetch API a while ago. This is one way to make a hypertext transfer protocol request from the front end, but there are also third-party libraries. One of the most popular is Axios. It says the syntax to make a request using Axios is cleaner than it is using fetch. It says in our fetch example, we had to use two then methods. With Axios, we only need one, so we do something like this. All right. And ideally, at least, we're going to be looking at a bunch of this stuff when we get into both from the client side and from the server side. Server-side rendering, it says, this is probably my favorite thing about modern web development over the past few years. Getting away from doing everything on the client and moving to render pages on the server. This is where the whole front end and back end distinction gets blurry. You're using a front end framework, but it's no longer just a SPA running on the client. Okay. All four frameworks that were talked about have what they call a parent framework. So they all use this. All right. Next.js, as it says there, it would be his pick in using this stuff, but it's based in React. So if you're a Vue developer, you use Nuxt, and there's other ones depending on what you're using. It says you can render pages on the server and have access to data fetching methods where you can run server-side tasks and have access to the HTTP request before the page loads. You also have a folder for API routes. If this stuff doesn't make sense, it's all things, as he says in here, they're going to talk about soon and will be in the class. These are for Angular and Vue, etc. So I'm going to skip those. All right. Let's jump into right here, SEO. Again, when you build a SPA, a single page app, the browser loads the page, then it loads the JavaScript bundle that includes your front end. As mentioned there, the problem with this is historically, when search engines are going through and optimizing, you have historically had a multi-page site. So they could go in and crawl through or spider each page individually. All right, that doesn't really happen with a SPA because, as it says, the search engine can't crawl your pages because they're loaded afterwards using JavaScript. As mentioned here, this has been an issue with SPAs for a long time. Now that we can render pages server-side, they can get loaded as a regular HTML page so they can be crawled. Routing is much simpler rather with server-side rendering. Instead of having to define all your routes, you simply specify files and components in a folder and let the routes just work. It's a little bit more complex than that. You also get performance benefit because pages load faster and are pre-filled with data. It's also more convenient to work that way. It's also more secure to work that way. All right. Static site generators. We're not going to spend much time on these. Why? Because I have used very few of these and very little of the very few I've used. So as he says here, the next batch of technology are static site generators, which allow you to generate your website and content using data from markdown files, APIs, headless content management systems, which they're going to get into. All right. It says these frameworks get all the data ahead of time and preloaded, as opposed to coming to the page and waiting for the data to be fetched. There are drawbacks of doing this because if you have data that's constantly changing, all right, so for instance, if this was going to be a news site where you were constantly giving updates, this might not be the best way to do it. But again, if you've got a blog or something that does get updated, but maybe just once a day, it's a lot better option. Gatsby, again, uses React. I've watched some tutorials on Gatsby. I've never done any work with it. Pages you create are simply React components. Next.js, as it says, renders React on the server, but it can also be used to generate sites. Gridsome I've never used. Eleventy I've never used. Jekyll I've never used. Hugo I've never used. Okay? So what are the benefits of actually using some of this stuff? They are, as it says, speed and performance, search engine optimization, simplicity, security, easier deployment. All right. So with that, let's jump into and talk about Headless CMS, which you may or may not have heard of before. Since when you think of a content management, a lot of people think of WordPress or Drupal, or as if you're old like me, Joomla and PHP Nuke. I have worked with WordPress. I have looked at Drupal. I have worked with Joomla. All right. It says these are systems that you and your clients can log into in some kind of an admin area and add and manage content. Now, I probably have mentioned this before, and I'm not, believe me, what I'm about to show you, it's not like I'm particularly proud of this, but I just want to show this to you. A couple of years ago, I had my students as a project in the AWD 1000 class create a website for a woman in, I think it's in St. Charles, but I could be wrong, and she owns the equivalent of a hospice for pets. So animals that are dying that don't have a home or animals that can't be placed, she takes in as many as possible. All right. And she runs totally off of donations. So she did not have a website. So I said, well, I'll have my students build one and you can pick the one you like. All right. So let's see, what is it? It's Arrow Bridge. Is it Arrow Bridge Rescue.rescue.com? It's probably not going to find it. I'm probably giving you the wrong. That is it. So what happened was the students went in and they built her examples sites, and some of them were really, really, really good. In fact, really all of them in their own way were really good. But the woman who runs the Arrow Bridge Rescue did not know or does not know HTML, JavaScript, CSS, etc. So she wanted something simpler. So I took a culmination of these and I wrote this. All right. And again, not that it's that great. That's her name, Caitlin Kincaid. That's a copy of her business card. All right. And if we come through here are some of her success stories. All right. So you can go to the About and find some of them. Here's a photo gallery with about 20 or 30 pictures. You can click on any picture and get a bigger picture or bigger copy of it. It will come up eventually. I don't know why it's that slow, but it is. All right. And let me just back up here. And it has a shop in there. The only thing she has available all year round are these little tote bags, but you can actually grab one, put it in the cart, etc. All right. So why am I telling you this? Because this is an example of using a content management system. This was much easier for her to use. If she went to the contact page here and decided, I don't want this to say your thoughts. Maybe I want that to say message. She could go in herself and just update what needed to be updated. All right? Okay. And again, this is a very simplistic site, but I created it for what Ms. Kincaid wanted to have. All right. A headless CMS that has an admin area but has no front end. You're free to use whatever you like for the front end. Again, WordPress in the example I just showed you. Scrappy, I've never looked at. Sanity.io, I've never looked at. That's why with some of these, I'm just blazing through this, because if I haven't looked at it, why should I sit and read to you? All right, so I mentioned WordPress. So as it says, yes, WordPress can also be used as a headless CMS. You can use the admin area instead of having a template. When you get into WordPress, you have this big admin area where you can say, what do you want to work on? What do you want to do with it, etc. All right. So Traversy finishes up, I believe, this section by saying headless CMSs have a bright future because they take much of the work of creating the back end away. All right. says the last few technologies that we looked at can fit into something called the Jamstack. Jamstack is a very broad term, as it says, for an architectural approach to building websites. It was originally presented with a capital JAM, which stood for JavaScript APIs and Markup. All right, it says, from what I understand, they got rid of that acronym and it's defined more broadly. You can go to jamstack.wtf to see what it's about. He says what he has done here, let's just look quickly. There it is. Again, not a pretty site, but got all the stuff in there that you'd probably want if you're going down that route. Here are some of the summarized information about the Jamstack. Jamstack sites can use a variety of tools and technology. All right. Everything is decoupled. The front end tooling is separate from the back end. Again, depending, that makes it easier as far as assigning responsibilities, and it also makes it more difficult if the front end and back end are not as alike as maybe they could be or should be. Static first, I've never looked at. Serverless functions are something that are becoming more and more prevalent today. As it says, serverless functions are very beneficial because they take away the need for the knowledge, time, and effort and cost of deploying and managing a server. These Jamstack applications can be extremely high performance. In other words, they load quickly, they run quickly, they're fairly simplistic to use. You can typically in these create very professional looking animation graphics and charts without doing much work. And they talk about some of the things you can use. Motion UI, Framer Motion, Anime.js, 3.js, Chart.js, D3, GreenSock, I should say. Some of these, I've never used these before. All right. And I believe we're near the end of this chapter. So the next thing that's discussed in here is perhaps the most interesting thing we've talked about thus far. And that is what are referred to as no-code tools. As it says, they're GUIs that you use to create websites. They're typically as much 100% drag and drop to create things like forms and menus as possible. All right? And I like this section. I'd read this before, but I want to go through it with you. Because here, Traversy says, before I talk about the specific tools, I want to talk about a few things. First, many developers do not like these tools because they look at them as a threat. They think they're going to steal their jobs and render them useless. I agree with what Traversy says here, which is I completely disagree with this. In some cases, a business owner or someone that wants a website may choose this over hiring someone, but overall, as it says there, I don't think the majority of people looking for a website have the time to spend learning this themselves. Also, many of these are not that easy to use, right out of the box especially. Secondly, says I think that we can actually help developers and web designers, these tools. They're not just for non-tech people. Now, some of the more well-known ones. First one is Webflow. Now, this summer, it must have been, I think the week of July 6th, so about a month ago. All right, I went to the Rankin Technical College, St. Louis campus, and for a week, I taught 9 different middle school students. The class was called Website Design. All right, and what I taught them for the first 3.5 days was HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and Bootstrap. Then I wanted to go in and teach them Webflow, but I haven't really done a very good job myself of learning Webflow. So what I did was I taught them another package, not the same thing, but something fairly similar that's called MobiRise. All right, and you got to spell it correctly. And with MobiRise, you see that it is totally drag and drop. Now, it should come up and show you the website I built. So these were the people that were in the class that I taught. All right, there was Mason, Neha, Viana, want that. There was Mochi, AJ, Devion, and Kenneth. In addition, there was Kimbriel and Jeremiah, who missed about half the class. These are examples of some of the websites they built. Now, it doesn't do a good job in here. You can't click on it and really see anything. See what I'm saying? I just took screenshots. The point is, I built this entire website, and I built it in probably about 15 minutes using all drag and drop stuff. So when I went in here, and for instance, up here to create this menu, and notice I can jump when I run it, so I can, this is what it looks like. And if I click projects, you notice I move down. Social media, I move down. Home, I move back up, etc. I didn't have to do any of the work to do this. All right, I didn't have to do any of it. It was all drag and drop, and the stuff was built in. I had to tell it that when you click projects to go down to here. I had to tell it when you click social media to go to here, and when you click home to go up to here. All right, but I didn't have to write the code. I just had to tell it where to go. And again, this is pretty much an example of a no code type of thing. I was, if I teach this again to them next year, I'd like to go in and do some work with Webflow. All right, next is Wix. And I've looked at Wix, and again, it's very drag and drop. I've mentioned WordPress to you. Shopify, as it says, it allows you to set up an online store with very little work. And again, it's something that people who are non-techie people can use to set it up. Setting up an e-commerce site from scratch is no easy task. So for freelancers, Shopify can be very useful. So you can set up something like this literally in a matter of minutes. All right. It says, so we've talked about a lot. I would say that at a high level, we talked about pretty much everything that a front-end developer could do. It says, I'm sure for many of you, this is overwhelming. I want to encourage you to just think about these as the options that are out there. So as a front-end superstar, you should understand frameworks and at least know how to work with a framework or two. Again, we work with React here. Understand what state is, understand what REST APIs are, and what HTTP is. In addition, once you've begun that journey and you want to go up and add things, you can add things like TypeScript, server-side rendering, Jamstack, testing, and no-code tools. All right, so before I go back into the next portion here, which is backend development, so far we had like a learning type of chapter, which kind of was an overview of everything. Then we went into beginning front end, and now we've just finished advanced front end. So now we're going to go into back end development. So as you can see, we have so far gone through the learning and planning, which was an overall type of thing. We went through front end basics, and we went through front end advanced. Now next, we're going to go into back end development. And when you look in here, again, I'm going to concentrate on Node.js and a little bit on C# and skip Deno, Python, PHP, Golang, and Ruby because we don't teach them. I will talk Java, talk a little Kotlin. Will not talk Rust, Scala, R, or Swift. Talk a little bit about C. All right, so a lot of the stuff that's in here we will end up skipping. We will talk about node frameworks. We will talk about some of the other stuff and some of the database stuff. Again, I want this to where we're talking about the stuff we are concerned with. Then we'll jump into Beyond the Browser in Chapter 5. So again, the next chapter that we're going to run through is Chapter 4, and that's our beginning of our look into back-end development. All right, I'll be back with that in just a few minutes.